A chill swept through the air as Prudence Pierce moved through the shadow-strewn streets of Benton, Wyoming Territory, in 1878. The townsfolk cleared a path, mothers pulling children close, men tipping hats while averting their eyes. She clutched her basket of herbs tighter, accustomed to their fear but never comfortable with it. At 26, she'd been branded a witch for 3 years now, ever since the fever that had ravaged the town broke everywhere, except her small cabin on the outskirts. "Devil's woman," someone whispered as she passed. Prudence kept her head high, the copper of her hair catching the late afternoon sun as she made her way to Widow Jensen's house. The old woman was the only soul in Benton who didn't shun her. Perhaps because when death already haunts your doorway, superstition seems a smaller threat. The widow's cough had worsened, and Prudence had prepared a tincture of wild cherry bark and honey. She knocked softly on the weathered door, trying to ignore the curtains twitching in neighboring houses. "Come in, child," called the raspy voice from within. Inside the modest home, Prudence found Martha Jensen propped up in bed, her breathing labored. The room smelled of sickness and the lingering scent of stew. "I brought something for that cough," Prudence said, carefully measuring the amber liquid into a spoon. "You're a good girl no matter what they say," Martha whispered after swallowing the medicine. Her gnarled hand patted Prudence's. "Any troubles today?" Prudence smiled tightly. "No more than usual." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation, the pounding of hooves, men shouting. Prudence moved to the window, peeking through the faded curtains. A group of riders had thundered into town, dust billowing behind them. At their center, a man slumped over in his saddle, blood darkening his shirt. "Looks like trouble," Martha murmured. "Rest now," Prudence said, tucking the blanket around the older woman. "I'll check back tomorrow." She slipped out the back way, hoping to avoid attention, but curiosity pulled her toward the gathering crowd at Doc Wallace's office. The town's only physician had been drinking heavily since his wife's death last winter, and Prudence knew his hands would be unsteady. Keeping to the shadows, she edged closer. The injured man was being carried into the doctor's office, his companion speaking urgently. Blood dripped onto the wooden sidewalk. "Bullet went clean through his shoulder," a tall man in a dusty hat was saying, "but he's burning up something fierce." "Gangrene," another rider muttered. "Seen it before." Prudence bit her lip. Infection was deadly out here, but she had poultices that could draw out the poison. Not that anyone would accept her help. She turned to leave when a hand caught her arm. Prudence whirled, ready to defend herself, and found herself facing the tallest of the strangers, his eyes bluer than Wyoming sky fixed intently on her face. "Pardon, madam," he said, his voice like gravel over velvet. "I'm told you might know something about healing." Prudence glanced around nervously. "Who told you that?" "Old woman at the general store." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. "Name's Ethan Nicholson. My brother's dying in there, and Doc Wallace reeks of whiskey." He swallowed hard. "I don't care what folks say about you. If you can help him, I'd be in your debt." The desperation in his voice struck her. Here was someone looking at her not with fear or disgust, but with hope. "People won't like it," she warned softly. "People can go to hell," he replied. "Will you help?" Prudence straightened her spine. "I need to gather some things from my cabin. Meet me at the back door of the doctor's office in 20 minutes. Ethan nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thank you." As Prudence hurried home, she wondered what madness had possessed her to agree. The townspeople already despised her. Being seen treating a stranger would only fuel their suspicion. But the urgency in Ethan Nicholson's eyes had awakened something in her, a reminder that despite everything, she was still human, still connected to others by the fragile threads of compassion. Her cabin stood alone, a quarter-mile from town, nestled against the foothills. It had been her grandmother's once, filled with knowledge of plants and their properties passed down through generations. Knowledge that had marked both women as different, dangerous. Inside, Prudence quickly gathered her supplies. Yarrow for bleeding, echinacea and golden seal for infection, willow bark for fever, clean bandages, and her precious bottle of alcohol for cleansing wounds. She packed everything into a leather satchel, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. As promised, Ethan waited at the back entrance of the doctor's office. Wordlessly, he ushered her inside. The small room smelled of blood and cheap whiskey. On the examination table lay a young man, perhaps 20, his face ashen beneath a layer of trail dust, shoulder wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. Doc Wallace sat slumped in a chair, barely conscious, while two other men, Ethan's companions, she presumed stood anxiously by the door. "This is Daniel, my youngest brother," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Bushwhacked by rustlers 2 days back." Prudence approached the table, setting down her satchel. "I need to clean the wound first. Boil water, please." One of the men hurried to comply while Prudence gently cut away the soiled bandage. The wound was angry, the edges inflamed but not yet blackened. There was hope. "Hold him down," she instructed as she prepared to cleanse the injury. "This will hurt." Ethan gripped his brother's shoulders while Prudence worked, methodically cleaning the entrance and exit wounds. Daniel moaned, his consciousness wavering. "What happened to you boys?" she asked, partly to distract Ethan from his brother's pain, partly from genuine curiosity. Strangers were rare in Benton, especially ones who brought trouble with them. "Cattle drive to Cheyenne," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. "We've got a small spread in the Idaho Territory. Took a shortcut through the high country, ran into a gang working these parts." His jaw tightened. "They got 2 of our beeves before we drove them off, but not before they shot Daniel." Prudence nodded, applying a poultice of golden seal and echinacea to the wound. "This will draw out the infection. The fever should break by morning if we're lucky. And if we're not." Ethan's gaze met hers. "Then we try something stronger," she answered simply. Through the night, Prudence kept vigil alongside Ethan. His other companions' cousins, he explained, had taken rooms at the boarding house, but Ethan refused to leave his brother's side. They changed the poultice every few hours, coaxed water and willow bark tea between Daniel's lips, and waited. Doc Wallace had stumbled home, muttering about witches' brews and unnatural remedies, but made no real protest against her presence. Prudence was grateful. She'd been barred from helping before. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the office's small window, Daniel's fever finally broke. His breathing eased and color gradually returned to his cheeks. Ethan, who had been dozing in a chair, jerked awake when Prudence touched his shoulder. "The worst has passed," she told him softly. "He'll need rest and care, but I believe he'll recover." The relief that washed over Ethan's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Without warning, he caught her hand in his, pressing it between both of his own. His palms were calloused, warm. "I don't have words," he said hoarsely. Prudence felt heat rise to her cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with gratitude rather than fear. "It's nothing more than what anyone with knowledge would do." "Not nothing," Ethan insisted. "You saved him when others wouldn't even try." A sound at the door made them both turn. Sheriff Mills stood in the doorway, his weathered face set in hard lines as he took in the scene. "Miss Pierce," he said coldly. "Practicing medicine now, are we?" Prudence withdrew her hand from Ethan's. "Just helping someone in need, Sheriff. Dr. Wallace has filed a complaint." The sheriff's hand rested meaningfully on his holstered gun. Says you've been interfering with his patient, using unauthorized treatments. Ethan stood, his height imposing in the small room. My brother would be dead if not for Miss Pierce. Doc Wallace was too drunk to help him. That's not for you to decide, stranger. Sheriff Mills narrowed his eyes. We have laws and proper ways in Benton. Laws against saving lives, Ethan challenged. The tension in the room thickened. Prudence stepped between them, heart racing. It's all right, Mr. Nicholson. I'm accustomed to this. She turned to the sheriff. I'll leave now, Sheriff. The young man needs rest, nothing more. She gathered her supplies, conscious of Ethan's concerned gaze. Change the bandages twice daily, she instructed him quietly. Keep the wound clean. If the fever returns, steep these. She pressed a small packet of herbs into his hand, in hot water, and have him drink it. Miss Pierce, the sheriff warned. I'm going. She straightened her skirts and walked toward the door, dignity intact despite the sheriff's scowl. Outside, the town was coming to life. Shopkeepers opening for business. A wagon rolling down the main street. Prudence felt the familiar weight of stairs as she made her way toward home, the whispers following like shadows. She was halfway to her cabin when hoofbeats approached from behind. Turning, she found Ethan riding toward her, leading a second horse. Miss Pierce, he called, bringing both horses to a stop beside her. Allow me to escort you home. It's the least I can do. Prudence hesitated. Kindness from strangers was suspect, often a prelude to propositions of a different sort, especially from men passing through. But Ethan's expression held nothing but earnest gratitude. Thank you, but it isn't necessary, she replied. Your brother needs you. Daniel's sleeping peacefully with my cousins watching over him. Ethan dismounted, standing tall before her. Up close, she noted the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Please. My conscience won't allow me to let you walk alone after what you've done for us. Something in his steady gaze convinced her. Very well. He helped her onto the second horse, his hands respectful at her waist. They rode in companionable silence, the morning sun warming their backs. When they reached her cabin, Ethan dismounted first, offering his hand to help her down. You have a fine place here, he commented, looking around at the neat garden beside the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney where her banked fire still smoldered. It was my grandmother's, Prudence explained, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of her home. She taught me everything I know about plants and healing. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. My mother was similar, Creek Indian woman who knew every plant in the mountains. Folks in our settlement came to her when they were ailing. His expression darkened slightly. Some of the same folks who wouldn't look her in the eye otherwise. The parallel wasn't lost on Prudence. People fear what they don't understand. Or who is different, Ethan added, his gaze meeting hers with unexpected perception. A moment stretched between them, a silent recognition of shared understanding. I should return to Daniel, he said finally, though he made no move to leave. Prudence nodded. Of course. If his condition changes, I'll come find you, Ethan promised. He hesitated, then added, We'll be in Benton a few days, letting Daniel recover before we continue home. Perhaps I could call on you again, to report on his progress, of course. The unexpected request flustered her. If you wish. Ethan smiled then, transforming his rugged features. I do wish it, Miss Pierce. He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Until tomorrow, then. As he rode away, Prudence stood watching, a strange lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. It was dangerous, she knew, to welcome such feelings. Dangerous to hope that Ethan Nicholson's interest was more than passing gratitude or curiosity about the town witch. Yet as she entered her cabin, she found herself humming softly, planning which herbs to gather that afternoon, wondering if perhaps she should bake bread tomorrow. Just in case of visitors. In town, whispers followed Ethan as he returned to the doctor's office. He paid them no mind, focused only on his brother's recovery. Daniel was awake when he entered, weak but lucid. "That woman," Daniel murmured as Ethan checked his bandages. "The one with the copper hair. She saved me, didn't she?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "Miss Prudence Pierce." "They're saying she's a witch." Daniel's voice held no accusation, merely curiosity. Ethan snorted. "They're fools. She knows herbs and healing, same as Mother did." He carefully applied the fresh poultice Prudence had prepared. "Rest now. We'll stay until you're strong enough to ride." As Daniel drifted back to sleep, Ethan's thoughts returned to Prudence, the quiet dignity with which she bore the town's scorn, the gentle confidence in her hands as she worked, the flash of vulnerability when the sheriff confronted her. There was a story there, one he found himself unexpectedly eager to learn. The next morning, true to his word, Ethan rode to Prudence's cabin. He'd bathed at the town bathhouse, shaved his trail beard, and put on his cleanest shirt. His cousins had teased him mercilessly, but he ignored them. A man showed respect when calling on a lady, regardless of circumstances. Prudence answered his knock wearing a simple blue dress, her copper hair braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. The sight momentarily robbed him of speech. "Mr. Nicholson," she greeted him, a hint of pink in her cheeks. "How is your brother today?" Ethan found his voice. "Much improved, thanks to your care. Doc Wallace even admitted this morning that Daniel will likely keep his arm, though he claimed credit for the treatment." A shadow crossed Prudence's face. "That's often the way of it." "Not with me," Ethan said firmly. "I know exactly who saved my brother." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her solemn features. "Would you care for some tea? I've just made bread as well." Inside, her cabin was neat and welcoming, with bunches of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with jars and bottles, a small desk covered with books. It smelled of lavender and fresh bread, so different from the trail dust and leather that had surrounded Ethan for weeks. They sat at her small table, drinking tea and talking. Ethan told her of his ranch in Idaho, the small herd he and his brothers were building, their hopes for the future. Prudence spoke of her garden, the changing seasons in Wyoming, the books she read during long winter nights. Neither mentioned the hostility of the town, but it hung between them nonetheless, an unspoken shadow. "How did it begin?" Ethan finally asked. "The talk about you being a witch." Prudence's fingers tightened around her teacup. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "3 years ago," she began softly, "a fever swept through Benton. Many fell ill. I had learned from my grandmother how to treat such sickness with elderberry and boneset. I tried to help, going house to house with remedies." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "Some accepted my help out of desperation. Others turned me away. Those who took my medicines recovered quickly. Those who refused, many died." She set down her cup. "Afterward, people needed someone to blame for their losses. It was easier to say I had cursed them than to admit they had rejected help that might have saved their loved ones. And since then, I am the Witch of Benton." Her smile was sad. "Children are warned away from me. Women cross the street rather than pass me on the boardwalk. Men make signs against evil when I walk by." She shrugged. "But I remain because this is my home, and because occasionally someone still comes to my door at night, seeking help they cannot find elsewhere." Ethan's heart clenched at the quiet dignity in her voice. "That's a heavy burden to bear alone." "We all bear what we must," she replied simply. Their conversation turned to lighter topics after that, but Ethan couldn't forget the glimpse of loneliness she had revealed. When he finally took his leave, he found himself reluctant to go. At the door, he paused. "I wonder if you might consider coming to town tomorrow. Daniel asks to thank you properly, and perhaps you could check his wound." Prudence hesitated. "The reception won't be pleasant." "You won't be alone," Ethan promised. "I'll come for you mid-morning if that suits." She agreed, though uncertainty lingered in her expression. True to his word, Ethan arrived the next day. Prudence was waiting, dressed in her best skirt and shawl, her hair carefully arranged. If circumstances had been different, it might have seemed like a young man calling on his sweetheart. The thought warmed Ethan even as he reminded himself of the temporary nature of his stay in Benton. They rode into town side by side, Prudence sitting tall despite the stairs that followed them down the main street. At the doctor's office, Daniel greeted her with genuine gratitude, his young face lighting up as Ethan introduced them formally. "Miss Pierce, I owe you my life," Daniel said, taking her hand. Prudence checked his wound, pleased with the healing. "You're young and strong." "Nature does most of the work. I merely assist." "She's modest," Ethan told his brother with a smile. Doc Wallace was singing a different tune this morning, claiming his advanced medical techniques saved you. Daniel snorted. "The only technique I saw him use was pouring whiskey down his own throat." Their laughter was interrupted by a commotion outside, angry voices, then the door bursting open. Sheriff Mills entered, flanked by several men including Silas Thompson, a prominent rancher whose wife and daughter had died during the fever epidemic. "I warned you about practicing medicine, Miss Pierce," the sheriff said coldly. "Now I'm placing you under arrest for charlatanism and endangering the public." Ethan stepped forward, but Prudence laid a restraining hand on his arm. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" she asked calmly. "I've broken no law." "Giving out unauthorized medicines, interfering with the town doctor's practice." The sheriff listed off charges that sounded rehearsed. "Thompson here has filed a formal complaint." Silas Thompson, gray-haired and hard-faced, glared at Prudence. "My Eliza and little Mary might be alive today if not for your evil influence turning folks away from proper medicine." "I never," Prudence began. "Enough," Thompson spat. "The town council's agreed. You'll be held until the circuit judge arrives next week. Then we'll see justice done." Ethan couldn't remain silent. "This is absurd. Miss Pierce saved my brother when your drunken doctor couldn't even stand straight. If anyone should be arrested, it's Wallace for practicing medicine while intoxicated." The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "This isn't your concern, Nicholson. You're passing through. We handle our own problems in Benton." "Seems to me you're creating problems, not handling them," Ethan retorted. Prudence squeezed his arm. "Please, Mr. Nicholson, don't make this worse." She turned to the sheriff. "I'll come quietly, Sheriff Mills." "May I bring some personal items from my cabin?" "One of my deputies will fetch what you need," Mills said, producing handcuffs. "Those won't be necessary," Ethan protested, outraged at the sight of the metal restraints. But Prudence held out her wrists, her dignity undiminished even as the cuffs closed around them. "It's all right, Mr. Nicholson. This will be resolved properly before the judge." She was led away, head high despite the whispers and stares of townsfolk gathered outside. Ethan watched helplessly, fury and admiration warring within him. "What now?" Daniel asked as the crowd dispersed. Ethan's jaw set in determination. "Now we find out exactly what's happening in this town." Over the next days, Ethan and his cousins made inquiries throughout Benton. The story emerged piece by piece. Prudence's grandmother had been a midwife and healer, respected if somewhat feared for her knowledge. After her death, Prudence had continued her practices quietly until the fever epidemic thrust her into prominence. Silas Thompson, grief-stricken and bitter after losing his family, had begun the whispers about witchcraft. Doc Wallace, embarrassed by patients who improved under Prudence's care when his own treatments failed, encouraged the suspicion. The town, needing a scapegoat for their losses, embraced the narrative. Ethan visited Prudence daily at the small jail, bringing food better than the meager provisions provided, books from her cabin, news of the outside world. Each visit deepened his admiration for her resilience and quiet strength. "Why stay?" he asked on the third day. "You could start fresh somewhere else, where people don't know these stories about you." Prudence looked up from the book she'd been reading, her eyes thoughtful. "This land has been home to my family for generations. My grandmother is buried on the hill behind my cabin. Her knowledge of plants and healing came from decades of learning what grows here." She smiled faintly. "Besides, where would I go that rumors wouldn't eventually follow? People fear what they don't understand everywhere." "Not everywhere," Ethan said impulsively. "In the Idaho Territory, folks are judged by their actions, not gossip. My mother was Creek Indian, as I mentioned. She faced prejudice, yes, but her skill as a healer earned respect. Our neighbors came to rely on her." "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Ethan hesitated, then reached through the bars to take her hand. "Prudence, when this is settled, would you consider coming back with us? My ranch needs a woman's touch, and the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride. Your knowledge would be valued there." Surprise flashed across her face, followed by something softer. "Ethan, we barely know each other. Such an offer is unexpected. I'm not proposing marriage," he clarified, though the thought had indeed crossed his mind. "Not yet, anyway. I'm offering a fresh start, a place where your skills are needed." He squeezed her hand. "And yes, I admit I've grown fond of you. I'd like the chance to know you better, away from all this." Prudence withdrew her hand gently. "I appreciate the offer, truly. But my life is here, for all its difficulties. I can't abandon it on a moment's hope." Ethan nodded, respecting her decision even as disappointment settled in his chest. "The offer stands, regardless of what happens with the judge." The circuit judge arrived in Benton on a rainy Thursday, a stern-faced man named Hollister with a reputation for fairness. The town council had prepared a case against Prudence, with affidavits from those who blamed her for deaths during the epidemic. The trial was held in the town hall, packed with curious onlookers. Ethan sat in the front row, his brother Daniel beside him, now well enough to attend. Prudence sat alone at a small table, composed despite the hostility surrounding her. Judge Hollister called the proceedings to order, reviewing the charges. Practicing medicine without a license, endangering public health through unproven remedies, and most seriously, using superstitious means to influence vulnerable citizens. Doc Wallace testified first, his testimony a mixture of professional jargon and insinuation, claiming Prudence interfered with proper medical treatment and gave patients concoctions of questionable origin. Silas Thompson followed, his grief still raw as he described how his wife had improved briefly after taking Prudence's remedies, only to worsen and die days later. "She bewitched my Eliza into refusing the doctor's medicines," he insisted, voice breaking. Throughout the testimony, Prudence remained silent, her expression revealing nothing. When her turn came to speak, she stood with quiet dignity. "I have never claimed to be a doctor," she began. "I use knowledge passed down through generations, remedies made from plants that grow wild in these hills. The same plants indigenous peoples have used for centuries, the same preparations frontier women have relied upon when doctors were unavailable." Her voice strengthened. "I have never turned anyone away who sought help, nor have I ever charged for my assistance. I have never interfered with Dr. Wallace's treatment of any patient who chose his care. Judge Hollister studied her over his spectacles. Did you administer treatment to the young man recently shot during an altercation north of town? I did, Your Honor, at his brother's request when Dr. Wallace was. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Indisposed. Indisposed how? Ethan stood before Prudence could answer. Your Honor, if I may, I'm Ethan Nicholson, brother to Daniel Nicholson, who was wounded. Miss Pierce saved my brother's life when Doc Wallace was too drunk to stand, let alone perform surgery. I witnessed this personally. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge beckoned Ethan forward and swore him in as a witness. Ethan recounted finding Daniel's wound festering, the doctor incapacitated by whiskey, and Prudence's skilled, effective treatment. And your brother recovered? The judge asked. Completely, Your Honor. Ethan gestured to Daniel. He's here today, with full use of his arm, thanks entirely to Miss Pierce's care. Judge Hollister called Daniel to testify as well, then questioned Doc Wallace sharply about his condition on the night in question. The doctor's evasive answers did little to help his credibility. As the testimony continued, an unexpected witness came forward. Widow Jensen, frail but determined, supported by her nephew. Miss Pierce has been tending my consumption for months, the old woman declared in a wavering voice. When Doc Wallace told me nothing could be done except wait for the end, she brought teas that ease my breathing and poultices that break up the congestion in my chest. She fixed the judge with a direct gaze. I'm still dying. Your Honor, I know that, but I suffer less because of her kindness. Others came forward, then a mother whose child's fever had broken after Prudence's herbal bath, a farmer whose infected hand had healed under her care. Not many, but enough to counter the narrative of universal fear and resentment. When all testimony concluded, Judge Hollister retired to consider his verdict. The wait stretched for hours. Ethan paced outside the town hall, worry gnawing at him. Finally, court reconvened as dusk approached. This case, Judge Hollister began, presents complex questions about medical practice, community standards, and the limits of formal authority in frontier settings. He folded his hands on the bench before him. Having considered all testimony, I find insufficient evidence that Miss Pierce has engaged in harmful practices or deliberately interfered with licensed medical treatment. Relief washed through Ethan. Beside him, Daniel squeezed his shoulder. However, the judge continued, there are legitimate concerns about unregulated medical care, regardless of intent. Therefore, my ruling is as follows. Miss Prudence Pierce may continue to provide herbal remedies and basic care within strict limitations. She must not represent herself as a physician, must obtain informed consent from all those she treats, and must refer serious cases to Dr. Wallace when available and competent. His gaze flicked meaningfully to the town doctor. As for Dr. Wallace, Hollister added, I am reporting to the Territorial Medical Board regarding concerns about his fitness to practice. Sheriff Mills, I suggest you focus your enforcement efforts on actual crimes rather than community disputes. With a bang of his gavel, the judge adjourned court. The crowd erupted in mixed reactions, some pleased, others disgruntled. Ethan pushed through to Prudence, who stood quietly accepting congratulations from the few supporters who dared approach her publicly. You're free, he said, unable to contain his smile. With conditions, she amended, but her relief was evident. Let me walk you home, he offered, suddenly aware that despite the favorable ruling, tensions remained high. Prudence nodded gratefully. They left the town hall together, ignoring the stares and whispers. Outside, the evening had turned mild, stars emerging in the darkening sky. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the edge of town. "Thank you," Prudence said suddenly, "for your testimony and for standing by me when others wouldn't." "I only spoke the truth," Ethan replied. "You're an extraordinary woman, Prudence Pierce." In the gathering darkness, her face was half in shadow, but he could see the shine of unshed tears in her eyes. "No one has defended me like that since my grandmother died." Something protective and fierce rose in Ethan's chest. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. "You shouldn't have to stand alone." Their fingers entwined naturally, as if they'd held hands 100 times before. They continued toward her cabin, the connection between them deepening with each step. At her door, Prudence turned to him, bathed in the silver light of the rising moon. "Would you like to come in for tea?" "Very much," Ethan replied honestly. Inside, as Prudence prepared tea, Ethan built up the fire against the evening chill. The domestic scene felt surprisingly right, as if they had done this together many times before. "We'll be leaving soon," he said as they sat before the fire. "Daniel's well enough to travel. We need to get back before winter makes the mountain passes difficult." Prudence nodded, eyes on her teacup. "Safe travels, then." "My offer still stands," Ethan said carefully. "There's a place for you at my ranch if you want it." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "As what, Ethan?" "Your healer, your housekeeper, as whatever you wish to be." He set aside his cup and moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Prudence, I know it's sudden. I know we've known each other only days, but sometimes life doesn't grant us years to recognize what's important." He drew a deep breath. "I admire your courage, your knowledge, your compassion. I would be honored if you would consider a future that includes me." Prudence's eyes widened. "Are you proposing marriage, Ethan Nicholson?" "I suppose I am," he said, surprised at how right it felt. "Though I'd understand if you wanted more time. We could begin with you coming to Idaho as our healer, getting to know each other properly." "And if I decline?" she asked softly. Ethan forced himself to be honest. "Then I'll leave with regret but respect for your choice. And perhaps write letters if you'd permit it." Prudence studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've spent 3 years being feared and shunned by people I've known all my life. The idea of starting fresh somewhere new is tempting." She squeezed his hands. "But I need time to consider, Ethan. This isn't a decision to make hastily." "Of course," he agreed, rising to his feet. "We'll be here another 2 days at least." When he left that night, Ethan felt both hope and uncertainty. He had laid his heart bare, something he'd never expected to do in this small Wyoming town with a woman he'd known less than a week. Yet something about Prudence Pierce called to him, a recognition beyond rational explanation. The next day, as Ethan and his cousins prepared for departure, loading supplies and checking equipment, word came that a child had fallen ill at a homestead outside town. The symptoms described high fever, difficulty breathing. Rash suggested scarlet fever, a deadly threat especially to the young. Doc Wallace, perhaps spurred by the judge's warning, had ridden out immediately, but sent word back requesting Prudence's assistance, specifically her fever remedies. The request, coming from the doctor who had testified against her, sent ripples of surprise through the town. Ethan accompanied Prudence to the Simpson homestead, a small farm 3 miles from Benton. They found Doc Wallace grim-faced, the parents distraught. 8-year-old Emma Simpson lay burning with fever, her breathing labored, a bright rash covering her neck and chest. "I've given her quinine," Wallace said curtly to Prudence. "It's not helping. The judge said we should work together in serious cases. Well, this is serious." Prudence nodded, immediately unpacking her supplies. "We need to cool her body first. Do you have willow bark, doctor?" "Used the last in my kit yesterday," he admitted. "I brought some." She measured dried bark into a pot of water to steep. "We'll need cool cloths for her forehead and neck, and a steam tent with these herbs to ease her breathing." Together, they worked through the afternoon and into the night. Ethan helped where he could, fetching water, building fire for the medicinal brews, supporting the exhausted parents. He watched in admiration as Prudence worked alongside Doc Wallace, their previous animosity set aside in service to the sick child. By dawn, Emma's fever had broken. The rash was fading, her breathing easier. Doc Wallace examined her thoroughly, then nodded in satisfaction. "She'll recover," he told the parents. "Keep giving her the tea Miss Pierce prepared every few hours and the broth to build her strength." Outside, as they prepared to leave, the doctor turned to Prudence. "You knew exactly what to do," he said gruffly. "Where did you learn about the steam treatment?" "My grandmother," Prudence replied. "She nursed through 3 scarlet fever outbreaks in her lifetime." Wallace nodded slowly. Perhaps we could share knowledge on occasion, for the benefit of patients." It wasn't quite an apology, but Prudence accepted the olive branch gracefully. "I'd welcome that, doctor." As they rode back toward town, exhausted but satisfied, Ethan marveled at the transformation. "You've earned his respect," he told Prudence. "That's no small thing." "One case doesn't change everything," she cautioned, "but it's a beginning." They parted at the edge of town, Ethan to catch a few hours' sleep before the final preparations for departure, Prudence to return home and rest after the long night. "Think about my offer," Ethan reminded her as they said goodbye. "We leave tomorrow at midday." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I will." Ethan spent the day helping his brother and cousins prepare for the journey home. Daniel's strength had returned remarkably, though he would need to take care with his shoulder for some time. They purchased supplies, settled their bills, and packed their saddlebags for the long ride to Idaho. Throughout the day, Ethan found himself watching the road from Prudence's cabin, hoping to see her approaching. But she didn't come. As noon approached the next day, Ethan made a decision. "You boys head out," he told his brother and cousins. "I have one more thing to do. I'll catch up." Daniel gave him a knowing look. "She's special, isn't she?" "Yes," Ethan admitted simply. "Don't be too long," his brother advised. "Winter comes early in the high country." Ethan rode to Prudence's cabin, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Had she decided? Would she come with him, or had she chosen to remain in the place she called home despite its cruelties? The cabin stood silent, smoke curling from the chimney. Ethan dismounted, approaching with uncertainty. He knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened to reveal Prudence, her copper hair loose around her shoulders, eyes red as if she'd been crying. "Ethan," she said softly, "I thought you'd be gone by now." "Not without saying goodbye," he replied. "Or hearing your answer." She stepped back, inviting him inside. The cabin was in disarray, items sorted into piles, some packed in a trunk, others arranged on shelves as if staying. "I've been wrestling with the decision all night," Prudence admitted. "This place has been my home my entire life. My roots are here, my grandmother's grave, my garden." She gestured to the familiar surroundings. "But there are also painful memories, prejudice that may never fully fade." Ethan waited, heart in his throat, as she continued. "Then there's you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "A man I've known barely a week, offering a new beginning far from everything familiar." She smiled faintly. "It would be madness to accept." Disappointment crashed through him. "I understand," he began. "But," Prudence interrupted, stepping closer, "sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind cannot explain. My grandmother always said true healing comes from connection to the earth, to knowledge passed down to other souls." She took his hands in hers. I felt more connected to you in these few days than to anyone in years." Hope surged in Ethan's chest. "Does that mean—" "It means yes," she said simply. "Yes to Idaho. Yes to a fresh start. Yes to seeing where this connection between us leads." Joy overwhelmed him. Without thinking, Ethan pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that expressed what words could not. When he set her down, they were both laughing, breathless with the moment's significance. "Are you certain?" he asked, suddenly aware of all she was leaving behind. "No," she admitted honestly. "But I'm certain I want to find out what might be possible between us, away from shadows of the past." They kissed then, a tender exploration that quickly deepened into something more intense, a promise, a beginning, a declaration without words. When they parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "We should catch up to the others before they get too far ahead." "I need an hour to finish packing," Prudence said. "Just the essentials, my books, medicines, herbs, personal items." "Take what matters most," Ethan told her. "We can always return for the rest if needed." As Prudence completed her preparations, Ethan helped load her trunk and bags onto a pack horse he'd brought for the purpose. He'd hoped, despite uncertainty, that she might choose to come with him. Before they left, Prudence visited her grandmother's grave on the hillside, placing wildflowers on the simple stone marker. "I'm not abandoning you," she whispered to the presence she still felt. "I'm carrying your wisdom forward to a place where it can flourish." They rode out of Benton together, attracting curious stares from townsfolk. Widow Jensen waved from her porch, a knowing smile on her weathered face. Even Doc Wallace, emerging from his office, raised his hand in an awkward farewell. "They'll talk about this for months," Prudence remarked as they left the town behind. "Let them talk," Ethan replied. "We have a future to build." They caught up with Daniel and the cousins by nightfall, making camp beside a clear stream. If the others were surprised by Prudence's presence, they hid it well, welcoming her to their circle with easy camaraderie. The journey to Idaho took 3 weeks, across mountains and valleys painted with autumn colors. Each night around the campfire, Ethan and Prudence grew closer, sharing stories, dreams, and increasingly tender moments away from the others' knowing smiles. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking Ethan's ranch in a sheltered valley of the Idaho Territory, Prudence gasped at the beauty spread before her golden meadows, pine forests, a sturdy log house with smoke rising from its chimney. "Welcome home," Ethan said, his arm around her waist. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Wait until spring," he promised. "The wildflowers here would make your grandmother's heart sing." They rode down into the valley, greeted enthusiastically by the ranch hands and housekeeper who had maintained the place in their absence. Introductions were made, explanations given, the story of how Ethan had found his bride to be in Wyoming Territory, already becoming the stuff of legend with each retelling. That evening, after a celebratory supper, Ethan and Prudence stood on the porch of the main house, watching stars emerge above the mountains. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Prudence leaned into his embrace. "None. It feels right being here with you." "We'll be married when the preacher comes through next month," Ethan said, "if that suits you. Or we can wait longer if you need time." "A month is perfect," she replied. Already she was planning a garden for medicinal herbs, considering which local plants might have properties she could use, imagining a life where her knowledge brought healing rather than suspicion. Winter in Idaho was harsh but beautiful. Prudence and Ethan were married in the main room of the ranch house during a December snowstorm, with Daniel as best man and neighbors from miles around attending despite the weather. Their love had blossomed quickly but deeply, founded on mutual respect and understanding that grew stronger each day. As spring melted the snow, Prudence established herself as a healer throughout the region. Word spread of the witch woman from Wyoming who could cure fevers, ease childbirth, set bones, and treat ailments that baffled others. But here, unlike in Benton, the title carried respect rather than fear. Ethan watched with pride as his wife built a reputation for compassion and skill. Together they expanded the ranch, improved the herd, and created a home that welcomed travelers, neighbors, and those in need of care. Daniel recovered fully, courted a local girl, and built his own cabin on the property. The cousins stayed on as well, creating an extended family bound by loyalty and love. By the time their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Ethan's father Prudence had completely transformed the community's approach to medicine. She trained local women in basic healing, created a network for sharing knowledge and herbs, and even established a respectful working relationship with the territory's only doctor, who recognized the value of her traditional methods. "You're not just my healer," Ethan told her one evening as they watched their son sleeping in his cradle. "You've healed this entire valley." Prudence smiled, hand resting on her slightly rounded belly where their second child grew. "And you, my love, have been my protector when I needed one most." "Always," he promised, drawing her close. 5 years after leaving Benton, Prudence received a letter from Widow Jensen's nephew. The old woman had passed peacefully, he wrote, but before her death had insisted he tell Prudence that things had changed in Benton. Doc Wallace had reformed his drinking habits, partly inspired by Prudence's dedication to healing. Silas Thompson had remarried and mellowed with time. Most significantly, a new family had moved into Prudence's old cabin, a woman with knowledge of plants who was being cautiously accepted by the town. "Your departure began a healing there too," the letter concluded. "Aunt Martha always said you were meant for greater things than being feared in a small town." Prudence shared the letter with Ethan as they sat on their porch, watching their children, now 3 of them, playing in the spring sunshine. Their eldest son had Ethan's blue eyes and Prudence's curious mind. Their daughter showed early signs of her mother's affinity for plants. The baby, just learning to toddle, had his father's determined nature. "You ever miss it?" Ethan asked. "Benton, your grandmother's cabin, the familiarity of home?" Prudence considered the question seriously. "I miss certain things, the hills I knew like my own hand, the exact spot where the first spring flowers appeared, the sound of rain on that particular roof." She smiled at her husband. "But I've never once regretted leaving." "Even though you were known as the town witch," he teased gently. "Especially because of that," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Here, I'm known as Prudence Nicholson, healer and protector in her own right. Wife, mother, valued member of the community." Her eyes shone with contentment. "It's a much better story, don't you think?" "The best story," Ethan agreed, drawing her close for a kiss as their children laughed in the meadow beyond, surrounded by wildflowers that would soon fill Prudence's baskets, continuing a tradition of healing that had found its rightful home. In the years that followed, the Nicholson Ranch prospered, becoming known throughout the territory not only for its fine cattle but as a place where the sick found healing, travelers found welcome, and those in need found help. Ethan and Prudence's partnership deepened with each passing season, their initial connection growing into a love legend in its own right. People still called Prudence a witch sometimes, but they smiled when they said it, bringing their ailments without fear, seeking the wisdom in her gentle hands. And Ethan, gray touching his temples now but still straight-backed and strong, remained at her side, the cowboy who had once needed a healer and found instead the other half of his soul. Together, they built a legacy greater than either could have imagined on that fateful day in Benton, when a wounded boy and a desperate brother had brought them together. A legacy of healing, protection, and love that would endure long after their own story became just another tale told around Western fires. The witch and the cowboy who recognized in each other exactly what they needed most.